Reading between the lines, Buster Posey clearly felt like the Giants had lost their way, and he wanted the accountability to be 100% in charge of turning things around.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily San Francisco Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. My name is Ben Kasbeck, and on the show we provide daily episodes Monday through Friday, talking about the San Francisco Giants in a way that's data-driven and rational, but also simple, passionate, and accessible to all. I'm a former contributor for the baseball statistics and analysis websites Beyond the Box Score and Rotographs. I've been podcasting about the Giants since 2015, been hosting this show since prior to the 2019 season, and I'm a lifelong Giants fan. Thank you for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, so check us out there if you have not already, and please hit that subscribe button wherever it is that you're following the show. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to win $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineups. Prize Picks, run your game. And coming up on today's show, we're going to go over everything we learned from the quote-unquote introduction of Buster Posey, a man who needs no introduction, but introduction of him as president of baseball operations, which is still, the more it's sunk in, it's just a shocking move, only for the reason that he has no prior experience in this type of role. So we'll get into that part. He was directly asked about that, and his answer was kind of like, that's a fair question. So, whether or not this works out remains to be seen, but we did learn a lot from this presser. And the first thing we learned was essentially that Buster Posey volunteered for this position. Like, it wasn't that Giants chairman Greg Johnson approached him about the job. It wasn't anything like that. It was that, like I said, reading between the lines, I think behind closed doors, you would probably hear Posey talking about the Giants having lost their way under this previous regime led by Farhan Zaidi and, the Gabe Kapler era. And even once Kapler was out, just the continuation of Zaidi, and Posey clearly saw that things were different now culturally than they were before, and that he wanted to be in charge. And the quote that really stands out, both from Bob Melvin and from Giants chairman Greg Johnson, is as follows. So Johnson said, quote, "Buster is just somebody that asked for the ball here and wanted the accountability and not trying to work with other people, and that's really what a leader does. Really, Buster's desire to be accountable 100% for baseball, that spoke a lot to me, to everybody," end quote. And so I just want to clarify, like, when he says not trying to work with other people, that kind of doesn't read right. That's not really what Johnson was saying. What he means, what the question was, from Andrew Baggerly of The Athletic, basically saying, Buster doesn't really have the experience that you normally see or always see someone have who goes into this role. So why not, why the decision to actually put him in this role, and why not just have, if you're going to fire Farhan Zaidi, why not just hire somebody else and have them report directly to Buster, who oversees the whole operation but isn't in this specific role? And that was the answer that Johnson gave, which is that he asked for the ball here and wanted the accountability. And I think it's maybe somebody miswrote this, the accountability of not trying to work with other people, meaning he wanted to be the one. He wanted to be the one accountable and in charge of this whole thing. And Buster's desire to be accountable 100% for baseball, that spoke a lot. So that is what Buster Posey is taking responsibility for, is the baseball side of things, just the team, the product on the field. And he spoke a lot, Posey did, about what his vision is for that. He didn't speak so much about exactly how that comes about, and that's the real question. Is like, you can have these kind of desires to make it look that way, but actually getting it to look that way and be that way is a whole separate deal. And so that's where there's just question marks about whether or not this goes well, to me. Like, let me be clear. It is unprecedented, as far as I can remember, that especially in this day and age, that someone without without any experience in a front office is just thrust into this top front office position. So, the comparison that I made yesterday, Chris Young of the Rangers, he, I believe, was an assistant GM, and then he was a GM, I think, and then became president of baseball operations. So Posey has not been he's been on the board of directors. He's been, kind of an advisor to Greg Johnson. But to just replace Farhan Zaidi here is a huge undertaking. And so he's going to need to surround himself with people who can handle some of the things that he has no experience with, frankly. I'm, again, not doubting him. Well, I guess I'm saying I'm certainly not guaranteeing success. I would never guarantee success for anyone, but it's super interesting. I'll give them that. And so Bob Melvin also spoke to this about Posey asking for the ball. He says, when someone like Buster asks for the ball, you give it to him. He's meant so much to this community, to this baseball team, to the organization, to the city, all of the above. And so I just find it very, very interesting that, he didn't want, he clearly saw something wrong with the team. I think we can all see it. And he wanted to be the one to take full responsibility for fixing it. And in some way, if he can execute on it, then that's exactly what everyone has been clamoring for, which is a more entertaining product, less roster churn, more player focused kind of decision making, where you're not treating them like, puzzle pieces or pawns on a chessboard, and more like human beings and all that. And that's all fine and good, but you also have to have success on the field. And it takes a lot these days. It takes a lot in order to make that happen. And so, like I said, I don't think you definitely can't have just Posey locked up in a room making every decision by himself, but I certainly don't think that is his plan. And one of the main things, we'll get into it in just a minute, is that they are going in another direction at general manager. A lot of people don't realize that Posey is not now the general manager. There's a position called president of baseball operations, which is above general manager. And Pete Patella has been the Giants general manager for a couple of years after Scott Harris left to be the president of baseball operations for the Detroit Tigers, who are currently playing a playoff game right now. So anyway, they're going to hire a new GM, but I just wanted to point out a couple of other things. Basically, Shayna Rubin wrote this, and I watched the presser, so I saw this myself. But she says, Shayna Rubin of the Chronicle, take away from Buster Posey's introductory press conference, the Giants want to get back into the, quote, memory-making business, perhaps something they feel was unintentionally lost the last few years. Greg Johnson also spoke to that, and we'll get into Greg Johnson's comments later on as well. One more thing Posey said was, as quote, as time went on, I appreciated just what that meant, and what he's referring to is having all these legendary players around, and kind of the history and legacy of the Giants and what it means to be a Giant. So he said, I appreciated just what that meant, not only to the community, but to us as players, and that there's a standard and expectation for being a San Francisco Giant, and it's a privilege to try to go out there on the field and hold ourselves accountable to that standard. And so that seems to be the vision that Posey has, and just how he executes it is another story. and is to be seen. That part we didn't learn anything about from this press conference, except maybe a little bit of a comment about Blake Snell. So we'll get into new GM, Blake Snell comments, Greg Johnson comments, all of that in just a minute. And before we do, today's episode of Locked On Giants is brought to you in part by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the easiest way to get in on the action in over 30 states, including the great state of California, which is a fantastic thing. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Sign up today and get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. Prize Picks is the best way to win real money this football season. Which players are going off? Which ones aren't? Make your picks in less than 60 seconds and turn your sports opinions into real money all season long on Prize Picks. I've had a ton of fun playing Prize Picks all season long with baseball and a lot of success, if I do say so myself. And that will continue into the postseason, and I'll kind of point out when I'm making those picks. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB, believe that's all lowercase, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, that's code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. All right, here we go. More about Buster Posey, Giants president of baseball operations. It's still rather shocking to me in a way. It's also not, but it also is. And we've got a lot more to get to about it. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. And everydayers, I don't know, mailbag tomorrow, more that comes out from this news, like breaking news about Posey taking over. There's going to be a lot to cover from all kinds of different angles. So definitely want to get your feedback. I want to hear from the listeners about, if you have questions about this or comments. So kind of plan on that for tomorrow. Anyway, the Giants are going to hire a new general manager. So Posey said, he was asked about this, and he said that Pete Patella has been informed basically that he has been removed from the general manager's position and that he is expected to move to another role if he stays in the organization. So they're currently talking to him about other roles, but Pete Patella more than allowed, not more, you can't be more than allowed, but certainly allowed to leave if he feels, he'd rather pursue a position with another team. So it'll be interesting to see, like, with, someone who has far more experience than Buster Posey, like Pete Patella, does he want to, take a demotion to a lesser role when someone has been hired above him who is, just steps in with no experience whatsoever in this type of role. And so that's the kind of thing I kind of almost cringe a little bit at. I do just want to be honest with my opinion here, is that, you start to wonder, does that irk some people in the industry who have worked their whole lives in baseball operations, working up the chain to get to where they are, like Pete Patella, starting as an intern, 10 plus years ago with the Astros, and then becomes an assistant GM and then gets hired as a GM. And then all of a sudden, Buster Posey, who has none of that experience, just gets put into the top job, and then you lose your job as GM. So that's a reality here. And so when the Giants do go out and hire a GM, the way it works in baseball is that teams don't allow permission unless it's a promotion for you to interview their personnel. And so you couldn't take like somebody else's president of baseball operations or even GM to be your GM unless their contract is up or they're fired or whatever. But so who they hire is a big unknown as the GM. And so, and also for sure you're not going to you're not going to take over president of baseball operations with the Giants, but that's usually how this works is the GMs take this job perhaps with the aspiration of one day being a president of baseball operations, but it's a promotion nonetheless that gets you into this role. And so it is worth pointing out, I believe this is from Susan Slusser of the Chronicle. She says the new GM is likely to have extensive analytics knowledge along with experience in nuts and bolts front office work, especially negotiating with agents and handling arbitration cases. Among the possibilities, current assistant general manager Jeremy Shelley, and then she points out Johnson specifically named him during the news conference, former general manager Bobby Evans, and Posey's former agent Jeff Barry, who retired from CAA earlier this year, and CAA had a presence at Tuesday's news conference. Kim Eng, the former Marlins executive, is also a potential candidate. And so, I don't know much about, I know the name Jeremy Shelley, but I don't know much about exactly what his philosophies are and all that. I do know he's worked with the Giants for 30 years. So multiple regimes he's been through. Going back to Bobby Evans, I'm not going to lie, I don't like the idea of that. And then some of the other comments that get made in this piece later on, it's like bringing the band back together, and I'm just not sure that that's exactly what you want to do here. Brian Sabian's name gets mentioned. Brandon Crawford and Brandon Belt get mentioned about positions with the team. So there's got to be a balance here where you're not too much going backwards to what, let's be honest. The reason Farhan Zaidi got hired in the first place was because of the mess that they were in. And right now they're not in a mess. They're disappointing, but they're not loaded with bad contracts. And, when Zaidi took over, they were a luxury tax paying team that was losing way worse than the Giants are losing now. Right now they're more of a 500 team. Right before Evans was fired, they lost 98 games in 2017. This year, again, 82 losses. So 17 additional losses. Wait, no. What am I talking about? 16 additional losses. Wow. And the year before that, it was 87 losses or something. So anyway, they've never been that bad under Farhan Zaidi, and the contract, the payroll is pretty clear, and so they've got kind of a blank slate. So it's a pretty good situation that Posey and whoever he hires as GM is coming into, and the pipeline is better. It's not the best, but it's definitely better of young talent. But also, this was coming from Slusser, and I'm sure she's got some info on this. But she says the new GM is likely to have extensive analytics knowledge. Posey twice, once during the press conference and then once talking to Alex Pavlovich in a one-on-one interview after the presser, pointed to that he would want the new GM to have an extensive scouting background. And so I'm not that doesn't even get mentioned here in this piece from the Chronicle. So I'm slightly intrigued by why that she points out analytics knowledge and nuts and bolts work in a front office. Yeah, I think that's important, but Posey specifically talked about scouting being the most important thing in what he's looking for. So Posey directly said, first of all, that they want to hire someone as soon as possible. And then he also said, quote, "I want a servant leader." And I had to look up what that means. I'm going to continue the quote momentarily, but I had never servant leader. I kind of get it, but I had never heard that said before. So Wikipedia says a servant leader or servant leadership is a leadership philosophy in which the goal of the leader is to serve. This is different from traditional leadership, where the leader's main focus is the thriving of their company or organization. A servant leader shares power, puts the need of the employees first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible. So, Posey, careful with his words, and also that's really interesting. He wants a servant leader who can empower people. Ideally, someone with a scouting background would be important for me as well. Today's game is so much about meshing what your eyes see and instincts are with what the data is telling you, end quote. And so that was what, straight from Posey's mouth. And so it'll be very interesting to see who he hires. And coming up in just a minute, we are going to get into the rest from this press conference. And we heard from Greg Johnson, Giants chairman, he of the famous, kind of sort of break even comment, right? So anytime he talks, we open up our ears and listen. And he did address the Matt Chapman situation, the one that had conflicting reports. So we get a little clarity on that. So much more to come in just a minute, and we will get into it momentarily. And before we do, today's episode of Locked On Giants is brought to you in part by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. So I'm heading over to FanDuel.com right now. There's also, postseason baseball going on that you can check out. And then the 49ers coming off a big win, looking at their upcoming game at home against the Cardinals. Big favorites at minus 390. The point spread at minus 7.5 with minus 105. Odds over under at 49.5. So check it out. That's FanDuel.com. Today's episode is also brought to you in part by Game Time. I love going to games all season long, especially like on the road and traveling. In fact, you may see that I'm in a hotel room right now, and I may in fact be going to some games here shortly. Sadly, no Giants games to go to at this time of year, and that is why we're having this conversation about Posey. But I love it so much, and Game Time makes a real difference with the ticket buying experience. Number one, panoramic views from the seat. I'm going to a venue I've never been to before. I don't need a two-dimensional map. I need to see what does the view look like from this given seat, and Game Time makes that happen. And also the Game Time guarantee. If I find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit me and you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right, as promised, we are going to get into the rest from this press conference, including Greg Johnson speaking both at the podium and with Alex Pavlovich afterwards. Gotten retweets out of Pavlovich himself, Andrew Baggerly, the McCovey Chronicles, like this. I just tweeted out a quote from Greg Johnson crediting Pavlovich for the interview, but it's circulating because it offers some clarification on the Chapman situation, which we did have conflicting reports about. Thanks again, by the way, for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. Every day airs tomorrow. More on this if anything else comes out, if Buster Posey does another interview and we gain some more insights, like all that kind of stuff is on the table. I'm also going to put out, definitely some mailbag questions. I do want to hear your thoughts. And then as the offseason continues, it's just going to be fascinating to watch. And we are a daily show Monday through Friday. So anyway, I just want to wrap up some of the stuff that Susan Slusser said about the GM stuff, which again, I was a little confused about the lack of mentioning of the scouting background, which Posey himself talked about twice. She obviously wasn't standing there when Pavlovich was interviewing him, but also probably has some info to kind of say what she said. But she says, along with adding an analytics familiar GM, the team is likely to augment the front office with other experienced executives, with A's assistant GM Billy Owens and former outfielders Randy Wynn and Will Venable possibilities. And if he can be pried from the Yankees, former Giants GM Brian Sabian as an advisor. And she says, should they have interest, Posey is also likely to reach out to recent former teammates such as Brandon Crawford and Brandon Belt about positions with the team. Indications are that the team plans to retain Director of Player Development Kyle Haynes and Scouting Director Michael Holmes, but it's unclear if there might be changes to the coaching staff, with hitting coach Justin Veely a particular question mark, and with Alyssa Nakin's future role undecided, end quote. And so I just wanted to pass that along. There's a lot to unpack there, and basically I'll react to news as it happens. These are just speculative comments. So Greg Johnson had some, the clarification on the Chapman situation was very interesting, certainly. He also spoke about what he called 1-and-1 deals, which is the 1-year deal with or 2-year deal with an opt-out. And so you'll want to hear his comments on that. So regarding Chapman, this is a direct quote from Johnson in a one-on-one interview with Alex Pavlovich right after the press conference. He said, quote, "We kept hearing that Chappie was frustrated nothing was getting done, and yet we weren't getting any kind of response from the agents back and forth with Farhan. And that's really where Buster just reached out and said, hey, let's get together and talk. And that's how things moved along as we did it. And that's how things moved along, is we did it direct." Okay, so end quote. So it appears that Andrew Baggerly's story pretty spot on. Baggerly basically said exactly this, that ownership was frustrated, that nothing was getting done, and Buster Posey stepped in and helped get things done. So the Chronicle came out the next day with a bit of a conflicting report. I get it. There's nuance. Farhan Zaidi was hospitalized. You had at some point, we don't know if it was exactly during this moment, although Scott Boras was interviewed by the Chronicle and said The Athletic did not reach out to him for comment about that story. So I don't know. I'm not trying to start an argument between those two sources, but it does the Chronicle did seem to kind of push back on the notion that Posey's involvement was paramount, but Johnson himself basically says that Buster said, hey, let's get together and talk, and that's how things moved along, is we did it direct. So Farhan Zaidi was not allowed to speak to Matt Chapman because of the nature of, I guess a president of baseball operations can't speak directly to a player about during negotiations. So that will not be possible moving forward. So that's something to keep in mind. And I'm just reporting that. I didn't necessarily know that was true. I don't know to what extent you can talk to players. But it's just worth pointing out what Johnson said there. So on these quote unquote one-on-one or 1-and-1 deals, Johnson spoke about the downside of them, not just because, the obvious downside, which a lot of people point out every time the Giants have made one of these deals. But, if they have a good year, they leave. If they have a bad year, they stay, and the Giants pay them. Looking at you, Michael Conforto. No disrespect, but something like that. And I think more importantly, he spoke to it having contributed to their identity issue inadvertently. No one was trying to do this, but it's kind of obvious that he basically said these players are playing for their next contract. So they're out there, focused on like I think of Carlos Rodon. It's true of everyone, whether it's Blake Snell or Rodon or Manaea or whatever. They're playing for that next contract. Even Matt Chapman, right? Instead of playing for the San Francisco Giants and having pride in wearing the uniform, and what Posey was talking about, he wants players to play like, and that it's more, they're playing for something bigger than themselves. And anyway, I anticipate that they're going to move away from these 1-and-1 deals, which was not something we really saw until Zaidi came in. And Zaidi himself has been super clear. He said he used to be so against opt-outs that to the point of it was like a complete deal breaker that he would not give them out. So any thought that's like Farhan Zaidi just loves giving out opt-outs is completely not true. It's that this was the way they were able to get these players. These are the deals the players wanted, and that was how they were able to get them. Maybe the other flip side of that is like, hey, if you just offer them the big deal that they were seeking, in the case of like a Blake Snell or Matt Chapman, you could have just signed them to the deal more like what they were looking for, because these shorter term deals this offseason were unexpected for Snell and Chapman. The industry expectation was that they would get that long-term contract, but it didn't materialize, and so they got these short-term deals with opt-outs instead. But in the case of like Carlos Rodon or I don't know, Sean Manaea, you're talking about guys who think that they have more in the tank, and they want the short-term deal because they're just, that long-term deal isn't there. For Rodon, it was like, hey, you had this one great year, but we need to see you do it again. So anyway, Johnson, I think it was interesting that he spoke to this being a negative in the sense that it creates kind of this mercenary identity thing in the clubhouse where players, maybe there's not this unity and cohesion and I'm a Giant and this is my identity and this is our team identity, when you've just got these players coming in trying to get a contract and then planning on leaving. And so I fully expect that we've probably seen the end of that for the most part. It could happen at some point, but for the most part. So speaking of Blake Snell, who's gonna opt out and become a free agent, Buster Posey was asked directly about Blake Snell, and he said, quote, "Blake's one of the premier starting pitchers in the big leagues and has been for a while. He's obviously somebody who's going to be a priority for us to take a hard look at and make a decision as a group." And so that's not exactly what it's not like a earth-shattering statement where it's like they definitely want to bring back Blake Snell, because Johnson, who's somewhat of an extension of Posey, they're on the board of directors together. I'm sure they talk about these types of things in advance, like Blake Snell did mention, you've got to weigh and balance like the short-term need with the long-term contract potentially. And Blake Snell is going to be 32 in December and is probably going to want like a 5 or 6 year deal. And you do have to think about that. And does that put you in a bad position down the road? And so I think Posey's smart enough to understand that too. Like, just because he's different doesn't mean he doesn't understand that players age. I mean, he witnessed it as the Giants fell from grace and started being bad, was that a lot of players, himself included, started to decline with age. A lot of rebounds in 2021, but these big contracts to Cueto and Samardzija and even Posey to an extent, but to a much lesser extent, he was still valuable. And Belt and Crawford, as they declined, held the team back because they had a big payroll and a bad team. And so they still have to be careful, and they understand that, and Posey understands that. So anyway, those are the main takeaways from today's press conference. Obviously, much more to come as the offseason unfolds, as earth-shattering, seismic shifting news here with the Giants moving on from Farhan Zaidi and installing Buster Posey as president of baseball operations. Unbelievable. Anyway, that is all the time we have for today. Thanks again for making Locked On Giants your first listen every day. For your second listen, find Locked On MLB. Baseball guru Sully brings you A daily blend of humor and baseball, keeping you updated on every aspect of the playoff picture. Find Locked On MLB on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Once again, my name is Ben Kaspick. Check me out on Twitter or X at Ben Kaspick, Kaspick. If you like this show, please consider rating it or leaving a review. It helps me out so much, so thank you in advance, and thanks to everyone who's done so already. Can't wait to be with you again tomorrow. Thanks again for listening. Today, you are now Locked On Giants.